So, Dale, how do successful biotechs grow revenue? Give me the 25-word answer.
I think the main thing is that they're customer focused and they're not product focused. And that's the big dividing line between the companies that struggle and the companies that grow.
Okay. With that said, do product focused companies ever win? I imagine if you had, let's just say hypothetically here, because I believe I'm with you on that from a commercial perspective, but let me argue the other side. So if I have a super good product and it solves problems that nobody else can solve, can't I just engineer and manufacture a really high quality product?
There are cases when the 454 platform was introduced, there was literally nothing else on the market like it. And it started with the whole next gen sequencing movement. But I think those are very rare. Yeah. And I think there's a couple of issues there. One is that your product and the life of your customer is very small. It is not a big thing in their life. And secondarily is that customers don't think about products. They think about problems and then solutions and then products. And it's an old anecdote, but it's true. No one buys a drill because they love drills. They buy a drill because they need a 1/4-inch hole. And what they care about is pretty simple usually. Will the drill turn on when I need it? And will it drill a hole through whatever I'm trying to drill a hole through? They don't really care that you have advanced carbon fiber bushings in it. And a lot of the product focused language and the product focused attention is really completely misses what people are needing and what they're looking for and how they're thinking about your product. They're thinking about your product as just what's the best solution to solve the problem I've got, not what's the best product.
Okay. Once upon a time, I worked for a company and we went to the annual sales meeting in January, and the marketing team metaphorically unveiled this new initiative. And they said, okay, now we're going to go from being just a company that does things well, we're going to become customer centric. And that was the theme for the whole annual sales meeting. And the Monday after I got back from that sales meeting, absolutely nothing had changed. So this is not just my experience. I think it's a theme that we see among companies in terms of what they tell their employees or prospective employees they're trying to recruit, or they tell their customers, or they tell their investors, hey, we are customer centric. So maybe a good way of diving into this is, what do you give up when you become customer centric, right? So if you're going to start doing something that you weren't doing before, does that mean you have to stop doing something else in order to free up resources and attention to do the customer centric thing?
I think you do. You have to quit talking so much about features and functions and spend more time talking to customers and talking in the language of customers. And again, you see this often where both the sales decks and the marketing materials and the brochures are entirely inwardly focused. You're so technically focused on the details of the product that nowhere in there do you make any reference to what sort of a problem this is going to solve or who it's going to solve it for. And you see this, there's 2 or 3 tells when I go to a biotech company's website that will tell me that they're going to have a very difficult time turning this into a serious business. The first one is they don't make any reference to the problem they solve or who they solve it for. They go straight into talking about the technical details of the product. So they've got a fabulous solution to something, but they're not defining to what. But the second is, and this is an alternative to the product-led company or the product-focused company, is the investor-focused company, especially with startups, where half the front page is essentially talking to the investors and not to the customers. And that is always a gigantic red flag. And the deal is that you're not doing yourself any favors with either your investors or your customers doing this. If investors expect to see an entirely separate investor relations site, usually under a subdomain of your primary domain, this is very typical, especially in publicly traded companies. If an investor comes in and sees that, they're going to look at you as a more sophisticated company. If they see all of this investor stuff on the company's primary homepage, instead of talking about the customer, it's going to raise a red flag to the investor, as it should. And the other thing that I see are these companies that are so focused in on what I call entrepreneurial cosplay, where half of the homepage is about they got second place in the such and such startup pitch award, or they presented to the seed funding investor group. And the deal is nobody cares. This isn't going to sell a product. It's not going to get you an investor. It just looks like amateur hour. And all of those things are tells that at the top of the company, the focus is everywhere other than the customer. And if it's not on the customer, you're just not going to get movement. And the one anecdote I would throw in is that when I first went into biotech in the late 90s, I went into a company where the CEO was absolutely, completely obsessed about the customers. He would regularly get on a plane and fly to close a deal. In the senior management meetings, the first 45 minutes of the hour-long senior management meeting would be going over the prospect list. And as a result, this company went from under $1 million in revenue to $55 million in revenue in 5.5 years.
Was this product any good?
It was quite good. It was an oligo business. but the deal was that behind the scenes, there was all of this technology development work going on. We were doing physical expansion. We went from a 6,000 foot facility to a 100,000 foot facility. We went from 1 location to 7 locations around the world. So there's all this back end stuff that the customers never really saw because they didn't need to see, because the entire focus was on delivering the product to the customer and making sure that we kept getting more customers. And that's how you grow. You grow by being out there in the world, solving a problem, and attracting more and more customers to your product.
So one of the things, so I agree with you 100% on the messaging there, right? So messaging things towards problems and applications rather than products and features makes a lot of sense. I think we see a number of companies in the biotech research tool space do that. What I think there's confusion and I don't really see being implemented yet is really matching the selling process or the marketing process, if we want to extend it, to how customers want to buy.
Oh, so absolutely, yeah.
I would pull out an example from the software side with that. So this means I don't have to attack any biotech companies in particular, right? But so there's a company out there that's very well known, and probably people on the live stream are customers of this company. And you go there, they're a data broker, and you go to their website and you're like, okay, I'm interested in their products. You click on pricing. You get a page that says, hey, you need to talk to a sales rep to get pricing. Okay. You fill out the form, a sales rep contacts you, get into a meeting, and you have to jump through these presentation and Q&A hoops before you can even get to the price. So you don't even know if the company is qualified in terms of the budget that you have available to spend. They certainly don't know that. And so you just end up getting very far down into a selling and buying process before either party knows that they're a good match. And I think that is also, I see, if not that same thing, because biotech companies certainly don't put a lot of pricing on their websites usually. Some do, most don't. You end up formulating the selling process in some ways in a vacuum based on what you think the customer needs to know, or how you think the customer wants to buy, and you execute that. And I think there's companies that are losing business along the way because of a lack of understanding about how customers want to buy. You mentioned a few minutes ago, CEO would get on a plane to close a deal. Is that what the customer wanted to have happen as part of their buying process? Did they want to meet with the CEO and have him visit in order to get the deal, or would they have preferred to just sign a DocuSign document like 3 weeks earlier?
This was 20 years ago too, so it was different era when things were done by getting on a plane.
Right, but guess what? People are still doing those things today, because they were done 20 years ago, without really thinking much about, okay, how have things changed on the buy side? And to me, that's like a different aspect of customer-centric orientation besides just the messaging.
I think things have fundamentally changed, certainly in the last decade, in that you've got so much information available that you can do a lot of what used to be done in the early sales process before you ever talk to a salesperson. And people prefer that. They quite frankly would rather do their own research than take the risk of having a salesperson crawl all over them. And it benefits everyone, because also once the salesperson comes into the process, the customer's already got some background material. You've already got a decent starting point. And so now you're refining the reason why you need to choose one product over another versus doing basic education. And certainly 20 years ago, when we would buy instruments, the expectation was a rep and a tech would show up with an instrument and spend the day with us and, show us how to use it and let us put our hands on it. And that was the expectation before you bought a $500,000 piece of equipment. And I think things are a bit different because a lot of that information you can get without that sort of face-to-face sales-based research process.
Right. Yeah. So
But
this is a point that Gartner stresses a lot in their reports, which tend to be, again, more oriented towards software, but I think are equally applicable to the biotech space.
yeah, and there was a recent Gartner report that should send shivers down the back of everyone. They were looking specifically at enterprise level B2B purchases. But again, a lot of this applies in biotech. It definitely applies in places like pharma, that 85% of purchase decisions start with a consideration set at day zero before any research even begins. They haven't even so much as done a Google search, and they've already got 2 or 3 vendors that are in their head. And that 90% of the final purchase decisions come from that initial day zero vendor set. And what that means is that if you wait until someone has a need before you have a conversation with them, then you've created an enormous wall to try to get over. That they really need to know who you are before they have a need. And this goes back to one of the other things that I see in companies that succeed versus struggle, is that almost no one knows you exist. This is just the nature of almost any business, but especially in biotech, there's just so many companies with so many offerings. And if you recognize and understand that no one knows you exist, then you're going to do things to try to solve that problem. If you assume that everyone knows you exist, then you're going to just assume that as soon as word leaks out, people will be shoving credit cards under your door at night. And it just doesn't happen. You have to engage in proactive activities to, one, let people know you exist, and then 2, to actively sell your product once they're in market. So you really need both a marketing motion and a sales motion that's active and engaged, or the product is just going to sit on the shelf. And again, the Gartner study gives a window into what that process looks like, where people need to know you exist and have at least a vague idea of what you're offering before they have a need. And that unwillingness to acknowledge that really sets up huge barriers for your own success.
So how many, if you were to canvass the market and look at, companies that are under 5 years old, how many of them do you think are cognizant of that issue and working to address it?
I think very few. I mean,
We're
when I come into
talking like
companies,
single digit percentages, 20%.
I would say single digit. Yeah. When I come into companies to work with them, the number one problem is that, usually I come in and the stated problem is often around how do we best describe our product, or how do we position it against our competitor? And none of those matter if no one knows you exist. Over and over again, what I see repeatedly is that the number one problem is that no one knows you exist. And somehow you have to solve that problem. And you're not going to solve that problem by doing a poster session at a technical conference. You're not going to solve that problem by doing a peer-reviewed paper. Those are important things because it gives your product scientific validity. And that's something that is going to be important later in the buying process in order to convince them that this is a reliable product to buy, because it does have the scientific validity. But it's a very poor way to get people to know that you exist. And
so what are some good ways? You can draw out a little picture for me of what things am I doing differently if my goal, again, is to get people to know I exist, rather than my goal is to search for prospects that are in market at the time that they're in market.
And you have to do the search for prospects who are in market. I think that's got to still be a key priority. So you've got to be present in places like the search engines, where people are going to go to search for options. But there also needs to be some sort of generally always on, basically brand awareness marketing. It needs to be very simple, because you've got very little attention span. The average person is hit by about 6,000 to 8,000 ads a day. The average ad duration is under 2 seconds, because they scroll through it or they click through it. And so you've really got 2.5 to 3.5 seconds to send a message, which means you've got room for 6 words. And somehow you need to let them know your logo, what you call your product or your company, the category that it's in, and then something about the problem that it solves. And you've got relatively little space. Video ads tend to be much better simply because there's a higher attention ceiling, that you can get 10 to 15 seconds of attention instead of sub 2-second of attention. So different ad formats and different platforms can dramatically vary in terms of attention. But the rule of thumb is that you need 2.5 seconds of focused attention in order for there to be any possibility of the content of that message transferring to long-term memory. Otherwise, it just drops. You have full amnesia of having seen it. And the deal is that you need to implant memory traces in the heads of future buyers that you exist in what you do in as simple a way as possible, so that when they do have a need, you're the name that comes to mind. Or when they go in to Google, so there's 2 issues. There's unprompted recall, you're the name that comes to mind, or they go into Google and they say, how do I do digital PCR? And then they recognize your name because they've seen it before. And so that's prompted recall. But you need some sort of either prompted or unprompted recall in order to have a shot at being in that kind of initial consideration set when they're looking at a purchase. And this is really important for infrequent purchases, which basically means high ticket value purchases. If this is a $100,000, $500,000 purchase, they're not going to do it very often. And so there's going to be a long period of time when they're not in market. And that long period of time gives them the ability to forget about who's offering things. So it becomes important to just continue to put yourself in front of them through some mechanism, because you don't know when they're going to come in market. And so that once they come in market, they've got some sort of a recent memory trace of who you are.
So I want to tie the point you just made with a question from Martina, which was, do you think some of the problem is that most marketing tells customers or tells people what their problems are rather than sounding like they understand? And I think if we're not being with the product and with the features, and if instead we're trying to establish awareness of our company, to me, one of the best possible sort of activity sets involves associating your company with the problem, right? So if let's say your problem is time to screen a batch of cells, and we want to be able to screen cells faster. If you have marketing content or web pages, or if you are hosting events that talk about what are the ways in which people have historically reduced screening times, what are the technologies that have enabled this, who are the thought leaders that have really advanced the field here, and if you're doing those kinds of activities, to me, that's a little bit, I guess it is a little bit branding in a way, because you're branding your company as associated with that particular problem, and therefore building credibility with customers. Is that some of what you envision when you're talking about branding exercises? Because the most sort of abstract branding exercises, I would say, are mostly useless. Think of the Goodyear blimp. Football games, which are mostly people that are not buying tires, and there's nothing on the blimp that tells you it's associated with tires. I don't think the blimp even has tires on it.
Right.
Like, there's no association.
And again, there's, I think, a distinction between consumer marketing and business marketing, where biotech really falls more into business marketing, which is that you've got to make a memory association between your brand elements, your name, your logo, your tagline, and some sort of an underlying category. If you're not in market, if I'm not actively looking to buy a digital PCR platform, I probably have very little mental bandwidth for any of the technical details. Now, as the moment I'm in market, those details become much more important. So it really becomes important as you move into the sales process, where you're trying to get a very detailed look at what your options are. But before you're in market, the problem is that there's very little willingness to expend attentional focus on things beyond a very surface level, which means that you need to connect your branding elements with a category. And the deal is the category exists because it encompasses a solution to a range of problems. And so there is some inherent You know that you're going to do something with a digital PCR platform that you're not going to do with an electrophoresis rig. And so they solve different problems. So the category acts as is essentially a stand-in for the problem. And it can be a very shorthand. Again, you say digital PCR, you say electrophoresis, you say cell flow cytometry, and you immediately understand that these are solving uniquely distinct categories of problems. Now, how is your product different than the other three products in the category becomes increasingly important as you move into the sales process. But the deal is just because someone is not going to wake up and say, I'm going to buy an XYZ today. They're going to say, we need a digital PCR platform. And then the question is, what's the inverse association that occurs in their mind? Hopefully, when they say digital PCR, there should be one or two vendor names that will come to mind that will be the starting point for their search. Along the way, they may also find other suppliers that they didn't know existed, but you've got very narrow bandwidth to transmit information into long-term memory. You've got a very short attentional span and a very small amount of information bandwidth that can slip through that opening before they're in market.
I'm going to take Kelly's question here about assessing brand awareness. I'm going to twist it a little bit, right? So again, if we go back to the Goodyear blimp as like the most abstract form of brand marketing, and we recognize that. And I think the trend within biotech and software and other industries has been to drift towards more directly measurable sort of performance marketing type things. So pay-per-click ads. Somebody clicks on your ad, they go to the website, they buy the product. You can digitally trace the purchase back to a specific ad and point in time. What you're talking about with awareness, we know we can measure that in the sales pipeline, because if we're successful in branding, then more people are going to be coming into the sales pipeline and they're going to be buying more products. So we can measure it at the number of qualified opportunities that are coming into the pipeline. Is there any way to measure it farther upstream as to whether you are successful in your branding exercises?
Yeah, you can, and it's challenging. The standard practice is what's called customer panels, which is a sort of a fancy structured way of having real live conversations with actual customers or potential customers, which again is something that companies rarely do. But there are definitely ways of doing this, and it should be done. Matter of fact, any company that's entering a market that is not set up and running a customer panel is really setting themselves up for failure, because there's so much that you just don't know that's so easy to learn if you set up and run a customer panel.
Yeah, this is what they told us classically in the MBA world was do focus groups, do surveys. And I think one of the challenges that you have as a small company is, gosh, I'd have to employ a company that knows how to do this stuff, or I'd have to attempt doing it myself. And should I spend $5,000 doing that, or should I spend $5,000 on some more pay-per-click ads? Right. I think maybe we should table that for a future conversation, because we're already bumping up on the half-hour limit.
But one thing I would add in there is this idea of last touch attribution, especially from search. The estimates are that it is overestimating what search is doing by somewhere between 100 to 400%. That as little as a half to a fourth of those click-throughs from search actually got to you because of what you did in search. And what happens is that I heard about something or I saw something 6 months ago. I now, again, the digital PCR example, now I have a need. And so I go and I type in who sells digital PCR. And I see a list of companies, some of which I've never heard of and some of which I have heard of. And then I recognize one and I click on it. Or better yet, your company is running an ad. And so you're right at the top of that list. And I recognize the name. So I click on it. And so what happens is that search in many ways is not marketing, it's merchandising. It is the cereal aisle in the store. That someone needs cereal. So they walk down the cereal aisle. They see 200 separate choices. But out of that, there are a dozen choices that they recognized previously. And there will be blindness to almost all of the cereal boxes on the aisle, except for the Cheerios, the Corn Flakes, the Rice Krispies, the handful of brands that you've had prior exposure to. And the same exact thing is happening in search. Search is really surprisingly identical to retail merchandising in that sense. And retail merchandising works because Cheerios does a lot of TV ads promoting Cheerios, so that when you walk down that aisle, what is the Cheerio box and not the Tostios or the generic brands that you've never heard of. And I think you have to take that mindset when you're doing the search, is that you need people to already know you so that there is this prompted recall. And once you have prompted recall, you have a significantly higher probability that they're going to click on your search result versus someone else that they have no prior recall of.
Okay. I think that's a good spot to leave it. Certainly a lot of subject matter to dive into for future conversations.